I'm delighted to explore with you today some of the context surrounding the Victorian art world of Charles Dickens. Dr. Karen Youngberg provided us 2 weeks ago with insights into the literary works of Dickens and his highly successful marketing. And last week, Professor David Ellis revealed thoughtful historical parameters for this era. My goal today is to offer a lens into the multifaceted Victorian art world and an introduction to its relationship to this literary icon. At the same time, I'd like to engage you with the fascinating and often idiosyncratic dynamics of British art. I do so at a point that marks not only the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Dickens, but also the 1-year anniversary of my own return from a fabulous fall term teaching British art history in London to a wonderful group of Augustana students. This recalled my own college days when I was privileged to study British art history at Oxford University and to tour historic sites alongside preeminent British architectural historian Sir Nicholas Pevsner, and that's been a few years ago. When examining British art history, one must acknowledge, in this respect, that England often follows its own path. This independence was aptly noted by Sir Nicholas Pevsner in his lively publication, The Englishness of English Art. I highly recommend this book as a good read to all interested in this topic. In it, Pevsner remarked on the nature of this country, along with its cultural biases and foibles, quoting a Venetian ambassador to the court of Henry VII, who stated in 1497, "I don't think there is a people more prejudiced in its own favor than the English." Pevsner further quoted modern humorist poet Ogden Nash, who offered in playful rhyme, "Let us pause to consider the English, who when they pause to consider themselves, they get all reticently thrilled and tinglish." Because every Englishman is convinced of one thing, viz., that to be an Englishman is to belong to the most exclusive club there is. Yet Pevsner ultimately concluded, "So here seems to be unanimity at last." Only unfortunately, as soon as thoughts turn to art, these statements on English self-confidence collapse. None of the other nations of Europe has so abject an inferiority complex about its own aesthetic capabilities as England. A decent home, a temperate climate, and a moderate nation. It has its disadvantages in art. Karen asked us if and when we first came into contact with Charles Dickens. In my own recollection, my mother, here today, trained in English literature and history, introduced me to most modern literary giants from that nation. I guess I was destined to become an Anglophile. In terms of Dickens, I think as a child, I was most gripped by A Christmas Carol. As a member of the television generation, such an introduction was reinforced by watching Christmas-time adaptations of the story, ranging from old black and white movies to new color TV versions. I believe we're all familiar with this popular holiday tale. Even the character of Scrooge, perhaps by this time broadly referencing anyone characterized by particularly frugal self-interest. Furthermore, I witnessed the enormous success of Oliver, the musical, a contrast in its focus on a poor, underprivileged orphan. And along with my fellow Moline High School students, I read the required English text, A Tale of Two Cities. Most of us here can likely recite the famous line quoted by Dr. Ellis in his talk last week. "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," in reference to this historic French Revolutionary era tale. In fact, I recently saw our colleague, French Department Chair Dr. Taddy Callis, sporting a Lampoon t-shirt that pictured a man literally holding his decapitated head, stating, "It really was not the best of times," acknowledging the guillotine centered in Dickens' tale. With such literary endurance, a contemporary critic of young Dickens was certainly incorrect in his prediction that the writer would go up like a rocket and come down like a stick. My generation thus encountered Dickens in various media, but I fear, as Karen suggests, current studies likely do not have as many contexts from which to draw as we did. In framing Dickens in the Victorian art world, we should set the stage for traditions in England that tend to favor the written word over the visual work of art. One can point to the rich tradition of medieval illuminated manuscripts as a starting point, wherein the purpose of the imaging was to illustrate or embellish the text. Even as we move further along the timeline into the Elizabethan era of Shakespeare, dazzling miniature portraits painted on thin ivory sheets of the 16th century often referenced either poetic sonnets or specific stories entailed in portraiture and individual identity. By the time Dickens was born, 18th century traditions were well established. And while the French aristocracy enjoyed a decadent lifestyle and patronized artists who depicted such scenes as the swing, Enlightenment writers urged reform to education via the creation of the first encyclopedia, as well as dreams for utopian societies. These idealists fueled the American Revolution and ultimately toppled the French monarchy. English portrait painters such as Sir Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the London Royal Academy of Art, mixed idealized classical historicizing with lucrative upper-class portraits, such as Lady Sarah Bunbury offering sacrifice to the three graces in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. Neoclassicism aimed to elevate the mind and spirit to a higher place. It was the elitist viewpoint of the Academy. In Augustana's collection, we have an allegory of painting by British artist Gavin Hamilton, a leader of English neoclassicism and founder of the National Gallery collection in London. This is a perfect example of classical idealism based on Greek prototypes. Such classically historic paintings and pastels, like epic poetry, were seen as the highest level of art by such exclusive standards. However, 18th century English artist William Hogarth demanded change and launched a series of paintings calling for social reform. These directly framed Dickens's worldview. As Pevsner stated, like Hogarth, Dickens was a preacher as well as a painter. Take, for instance, Hogarth's 6-part series entitled Marriage a la Mode. Now, how do we use the term a la mode today? Dollop of ice cream. And in his title, it was kind of a slam to the French, if you know British-French sort of competitive, across-the-channel sort of dynamics. And his point was, this is marriage in the French manner. Hogarth was largely self-taught and was very much a man of the people, fond of sketching in the streets and pubs of lower-class London. He directly criticized the well-established aristocratic custom of arranged marriage. He sought to educate and narrate stories via strategic visual humor, reinforced by texts which were secondary to the images. Let's, for instance, look at Scene 1, the marriage contract of Marriage a la Mode. Each painting in the series is like a chapter in a novel, yet establishing primacy of image over text. Can you read this story? Let's first of all see we have two fathers represented. Can you tell that they're from two very distinct classes? Which is the aristocrat and which is the middle-class merchant? Anybody want to? Let's have fun. This is called Art History Playtime.
Aristocrat has silk stockings on the right.
Okay? Absolutely. Silk stockings on the right. And also has a long scroll pointing to his family tree that goes back to the Norman Conquest. You might also notice that his right foot is bandaged. He had gout, which was attributed to eating too much good, rich food, and I think his portly deportment reinforces that he lived a good life.
Just his position in the chair and the position of his arm.
Good point. Very elegant. If you know the paintings of Watteau, who was a court painter to the French aristocracy, there's sort of that elegant, graceful, aristocratic pose. What about the merchant father in the middle? The middle-class guy. If you want to turn down the lights, if that would help, we can do it. Is it too hard to see the details?
George Washington and House of Lord wigs powdered over.
There, don't you? Okay. So you can see that he perfectly has his spectacles on, and he's very used to balancing sums, right? And can you tell the difference in the level of their dress? At this time, even if you were a multimillionaire middle-class person, you often had to dress still as a middle-class person. You couldn't bump up to aristocratic dress. And if you were an aristocrat, you might have title, but guess what's happened to the family money? It's run out. So they're brokering a marriage with the hapless couple that you see on the left. Does that look like true love?
There's a great contrast in their posture.
A great contrast in the posture. She's weeping. She's the middle-class daughter. And what is the aristocratic boy doing?
Snuff?
Yeah, he's taking a pinch of snuff, and he's making faces at himself in the mirror. So not a lot of redeeming factor. And my apologies to any attorneys here, but you might notice that she has the attention of a lawyer whom Hogarth called Lawyer Silvertongue. And if you don't get the point, do you see that you have a pair of dogs, a male and a female, chained together? So this sort of tells us the basic story that we're starting out with an arranged marriage that's in the best interests of the parents. Now, what does the aristocratic father gain out of this marriage? A dowry, a money. And you see out the window, he's already building his new palace with it. What does the middle-class father gain out of this doomed-to-be failed marriage?
Prestige.
Prestige, and even if he can't raise his own position, what is he ensuring for his daughter and grandchildren? Aristocratic title. So we begin this by knowing it's kind of set up for failure. Now we may follow the narrative through the subsequent 5 scenes. The day after the marriage. How are things going? Have they bonded, so to speak? Well, we know one thing, the servants have about had it. Hogarth went out of his way to put the ugliest things he could envision on the mantle, with the idea that just because you have money does not mean you have good taste. And we can also see that the young gentleman, husband, hasn't been home that night. Can you see a visual clue? Anybody who's a dog lover might find it. Yep, the dog is sniffing at his pocket, and there's a lady's bonnet in the pocket with whom he presumably spent the night. So the marriage is not going well so far. Scene 3, the boy visits a quack doctor because if you see the very large spot on his neck, he's contracted probably some sort of disease from the young girl who was probably a prostitute with whom he has slept. And you can see all sorts of horrible sort of senses of what Hogarth's vision of 18th century medicine was like surrounding them. But does he care at this point? Is he worried? No, always devil may care. Meanwhile, the Countess is having her hair done, and Lawyer Silvertongue appears on the right, inviting her to a masquerade ball. Well, your husband's never home. Why don't you go out and have a good time? She accepts, and one thing leads to another. They end up going to bed together, and wouldn't you know, that's the one time her husband comes home. So as an aristocrat, what do you have to do? You have to do the duel. And the husband receives a mortal wound, and as he is dying, she begs his forgiveness, not that he's been a paragon of virtue. And does Lawyer Silvertongue stand by her in her moment of distress? No, I think can you see how closely this allies with theater as well? Sort of like exit stage right, while stage left the witnesses come in. Finally, it ends with this scene where Dad returns again, and the daughter has just committed suicide, partially because of her husband's death, partially because Lawyer Silvertongue was hung for killing her husband. And as she's about to die, can you tell what Dad is doing? Not much redeeming character there. Why would he take her ring off? It's worth something. You certainly wouldn't want to bury her with it, right? So Dad is always interested in what? Money. So do you see how Hogarth strikes morals home, but makes them a little more fun? Makes them a little more interesting and intriguing. And he always included small captions with these, so you knew the characters. But what Dickens will try to reverse is Dickens will want the text to be the larger issue and the illustrations to be secondary. Now, predictably, this decadence led to ultimate tragedy and a moral. In Hogarth's satire, it's a criticism of the French aristocratic practice of arranged marriage, and perhaps of all things French. The moral of the story, the need for more social equity and allowing couples to choose partners rather than following the self-serving goals of their parents, is abundant here. The popularity of these is reflected in their engraved versions, such as the series in Augustana's collection. In Hogarth's example, thus, one can envision the type of storytelling that Dickens could achieve in the following century as well. Yet Dickens aimed to reassert the primacy of text over image. In fact, he was extremely particular about the illustrators for his works and sensitive to their complementary value. Illustrations were indeed a fundamental aspect of Dickens's publications. Only two of his major works, Hard Times and Great Expectations, were originally issued without illustrations. Images were therefore important to him as he grew up and developed an appreciation for prints, primarily in the realistic satires of William Hogarth, as well as the caricatures of such artists as James Gilray. Dickens's books consistently revealed his exposure and debt to such earlier prints, particularly those by Hogarth. Dickens worked closely with his illustrators, ensuring his characters and settings were illustrated exactly how he envisioned them, including the number of figures framed in each scene, as well as their settings, costumes, gestures, and expressions. He indeed appears to have exerted unprecedented authority in this respect. It is therefore clear that illustrations were fundamental to Dickens and to his writings. George Cruikshank was one of Dickens's earlier illustrators and among the greatest illustrators of the time. Their working relationship lasted 6 years, during which time Cruikshank provided illustrations for Sketches by Boz and its cover design for the 1839 edition. The cover is a visual depiction of Dickens's metaphor in his preface, showing the novelist and artist ascending together in a balloon. Cruikshank furthermore contributed illustrations for the novel Oliver Twist, and proved to be eminently suited to illustrating the early works of Dickens. Oliver Asking for More is among the most memorable. Cruikshank was strongly inventive and had a keen eye for complementing Dickens's descriptive prose style, which readily evokes visualization and easily accommodates illustration. Unfortunately, however, the struggle for artistic control between the established artist and the aspiring novelist led to the end of their professional collaboration. In fact, following Dickens's death, Cruikshank claimed that the plot and many of the characters from Oliver Twist were his own ideas. Since the relationship between author and artist in the 1830s was one of equals, it is likely that Cruikshank could have been instrumental toward constructing the actual novel itself. For the original edition of Pickwick Papers, issued in monthly parts from 1836 to 37, the first plates were drawn by Robert Seymour. Seymour reportedly eventually had a nervous breakdown due to his inability to satisfy Dickens. Indeed, upon completion of the second installment of Pickwick Papers, Seymour committed suicide. In need of a new illustrator, Dickens personally selected Havlet Knight Brown, artistic pseudonym Phiz, as his successor. Now, this proved a fruitful collaboration that lasted some 23 years. Phiz was young and receptive, ideal for Dickens's purposes. He was also a recognized watercolorist and etcher. He contributed illustrations for 10 of 15 of Dickens's major novels, including A Tale of Two Cities. He became so sensitive to Dickens's writing that his own style and technique appear to have assimilated and mirrored its strengths, weaknesses, and changes. As Dickens would continually shift his plot and characters, Frieze kept pace graphically, enabling Dickens's imagination to inspire his own. In 1838, they traveled together to Yorkshire, where they visited various schools and gathered ideas for the novel Nicholas Nickleby. They continued to travel and make journeys of this nature together in order to facilitate the illustrator's work. Eventually, however, Dickens tired of Brown's illustrations and thought his talents old-fashioned. Nonetheless, their collaboration up to this time proved to be one of the most successful in the history of book illustration. John Leech was one of the leading artists of the day. He would later become one of the primary illustrators for Dickens's Christmas books. Born in London, he showed an aptitude for drawing at an early age. Leech befriended writers such as William Makepeace Thackeray, who furthered his artistic career. Leech excelled in drawing on wood, a field of black and white illustration, through which he made his reputation. Leech and Dickens became lifelong friends. Leech did, however, earn recognition in his own right, especially after becoming an artist for Punch, a satirical journal, in 1841. His independent reputation perhaps enabled him to become a closer friend to Dickens, for whom he worked because of friendship, not necessity, than would have been possible had he been subordinate to him from the start. Although Leech was perhaps generally more important to Dickens as a friend than as an artist, he was the sole illustrator for A Christmas Carol. Leech introduced a measure of beauty into his caricatures, lending refinement to a formerly crude genre that too often equated ugliness with evil and grace with weakness. Leech's aesthetic gentility had an effect on Dickens, whose own characterizations appeared to grow noticeably more refined after working with him. The artist, in turn, garnered material from Dickens's writing for many of his Punch cartoons. The author's affection for Leech, in contrast to his earlier illustrators, survived their collaboration and lasted until the end of their lives. Now, in terms of Dickens's own taste in fine art, his household words did not particularly feature art reviews. Dickens himself did not seem overly impressed by the old masters to be seen at the National Gallery in London. Household words did, however, include in 1856 an anonymous attack on such old masters written by Dickens's younger friend, novelist Wilkie Collins. In it was a condemnation of the elitist collection of the National Gallery that demonstrated, quote, authority standing drearily and persistently aloof from all popular sympathy. Purchasing pictures for the National Gallery of England, for which in 9 cases out of 10, the nation has no concern or interest, end quote. I'm guessing people might disagree with this today. Collins assuredly knew that Dickens shared these opinions. The article also likely reflected their mutual literary disappointment, by extension, that in most quarters the novel was considered simply a form of popular entertainment rather than great literature. Collins reinforced his aversion to collectors and connoisseurs in his popular novel, The Woman in White, published 4 years later in the successor to Household Words, All the Year Round. In the 1840s, many of Dickens's views on contemporary art were formed. Scottish painter Sir David Wilkie, however, had already exercised great influence on him. In genre scenes such as The Cotter's Saturday Night, Wilkie's love of humble subjects and careful character sketches paralleled the much younger writer's evolving viewpoint. Both Dickens and Wilkie, in their respective arts, sought to achieve a genuinely popular style in order to express human emotion. In a speech given after Wilkie's death in 1840, Dickens praised him as the artist, quote, who made the cottage hearth his grave theme, and who surrounded the lives and cares and daily toils and occupations of the poor with dignity and beauty, who indeed found books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything, ultimately quoting Shakespeare. Similarly, Dickens must have been influenced by scenes saturated with English sentimentality by celebrated artist Sir Edwin Landseer, portrait painter to Queen Victoria's pets. He also taught her drawing lessons. Augustana owns the engraved version of this work. Landseer also created the famous bronze lions at the base of the monument to Admiral Lord Nelson before the National Gallery in London, Trafalgar Square. But in examining Landseer's Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner of 1837, although he depicts a similar humble interior to Wilkie's in the same year, cited here in the Scottish Highlands, he charmingly demonstrates the English love for nature. Here the faithful sheepdog is the shepherd's only mourner, where details such as a Bible, walking stick, hat, and spectacles represent the dog's best friend, now deceased. This sort of Victorian painting is what I refer to my students as "aw" paintings. What pet lover can resist? And Dickens certainly noticed that Landseer was celebrated throughout the empire, and when he died, the entire nation mourned. In contrast was Dickens' reaction to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a young avant-garde group who embraced a sort of medieval Catholicism revived through the Oxford movement. One of Dickens's few reviews of a Royal Academy exhibition was published in 1850 as the lead article in his Household Words. John Everett Millais, ultimately the most successful of the PRB and future president of the Royal Academy, was the recipient of harsh criticism from Dickens, all the more stinging as the PRB were admirers of Dickens's work. In Millais' painting, Christ in the house of his parents, or the carpenter shop, the child Jesus has hurt his hand on a nail. As with scenes by Hogarth, furthered by Landseer's sentimentality, let's see if we can read the accessible religious symbolism here. Who is the young boy who's hurt himself? Jesus. And who is attending to Jesus in maternal fashion? Mary. And who just happens to be bringing water to clean the cut hand? John the Baptist. And Joseph the carpenter is looking on. And, well, we're already the good shepherd, aren't we? Because look at the host of charming sheep coming in from the left, looking on at what's happening as Christ is the good shepherd. It's shown in great detail, and it went along with the PRB's idea of making religious scenes viable again. In the 19th century, you don't see much religious art, but making it more down to earth and accessible. So they would have predicted that Dickens would love this. They were wrong. In many ways, it seems Millais was aiming to do with religious subject matter in terms of legibility and sentiment what Dickens admired in lower class genre scenes by Wilkie. Dickens, however, unpredictably despised this painting, writing, quote, "You behold the interior of a carpenter's shop. In the foreground of that carpenter's shop is a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy in a bedgown, who appears to have received a poke in the hand from the stick of another boy with whom he's been playing in an adjacent gutter, and to be holding it up for the contemplation of a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that supposing it were possible for any human creature to exist for a moment with that dislocated throat, she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England." End quote. Yet at the same time, Dickens's contemporary writer, John Ruskin, Slade Professor of Art at Oxford University, praised this movement with, quote, "Pre-Raphaelitism has but one principle, that of absolute uncompromising truth, down to the most minute detail from nature." Ruskin reigned as the most powerful art critic in Victorian England. Perhaps for this reason, Dickens instead generally preferred from this point on to present his artistic viewpoints within his own novels rather than as a journalistic art critic. Another interesting aspect of Dickens in art are the artists who illustrated specific moments in Dickens's work, as well as those who developed themes that were related to these in their characterizations and moralizing. In general, although in great abundance in his day, such works as The Old Curiosity Shop or Little Nell and Her Grandfather by John Chapman, which carefully reflect the spirit of the novels and sentiments therein, have not held up well to posterity as works of art. This story follows the tragic tale of the virtuous Nell Trent, nearly 14 years old, whose grandfather secretly gambles away the family savings in his quest for a better life for her. They encounter virtuous characters as well as scoundrels, but all lead to tragedy: her own untimely death and her grandfather's insanity. Here we see a carefully detailed Victorian shop filled with antiques and bric-a-brac, prefiguring perhaps the hoarders of television fame today. More successful, however, were works of art that were inspired by Dickens's literary example, translated not literally but philosophically onto the canvas. He motivated a style and approach to painting which paralleled his novels. This can be seen in the modern life movement that flourished in the 1850s and 60s when Dickens was at the height of his fame. Dickens gave artists the confidence to depict the world around them. Foremost of these was artist William Howell Frith. The ranking of history painting was so high within the Academy that artists like Frith had been reluctant to paint genre scenes of everyday life that were not masked in costumes like the PRB, or direct illustrations of literary works, as with Chapman's painting of The Old Curiosity Shop. Frith later recalled, "One of the greatest difficulties besetting me has always been the choice of subject, my inclination being strongly towards the illustration of modern life. I had read the works of Dickens in the hope of finding material for the exercise of any talent I might possess." As Frith instinctively perceived, Dickens's novels offered new opportunities for artists and freedom to explore modern life as a valid subject for art. The writings of Dickens and the paintings of Frith have many parallels, one very visual in its literary form, the other very literary in its visual form. In other words, the author's narratives created vivid pictures, and the painter's pictures evoked strong narratives. They both shared the same subject, the narratives of modern life, as seen in Frith's Derby Day, or Derby Day as the English would say, but each form had its own particular demands and opportunities. This was clearly grasped a few years ago at a major retrospective of Frith's paintings, where critics described him as a Dickens of a painter and Dickens with a paintbrush, and both found inspiration in Hogarth. It was not just the familiar scenes in London that appealed to both artists, but also locations peculiar to their time, reflecting the expansion of technology and empire, which also invited narratives. These places were the new palaces of the age where great crowds full of diversity congregated to carry out their everyday business. The railway was such a location. Frith's railway station of 1862 reflects the hustle and bustle of this new modern age, which was artfully described in Dickens's Dombey and Son. To and from the heart of this great change, all day and night, throbbing currents rushed and returned incessantly like its life's blood. Crowds of people and mountains of goods, departing and arriving scores upon scores of times in every 4 and 20 hours, produced a fermentation in the place that was always in action. The very houses seemed disposed to pack up and take trips. Frith similarly described the railway terminus at Paddington as his backdrop for various narratives here. One of the great metropolitan temples of the age, the General Post Office here epitomized centralized communications from the heart of the empire to its far-flung outposts throughout the world. The site was so famous that it drew crowds of tourists to not only see the new style of building with steel and glass, but also its great hub of activity. Such railway travel via these marvels of technology necessitated for the first time national standardized time. If large metropolitan scenes with their variety of crowds provided a rich subject for modern life painters, the task of depicting a crowd en masse was a particularly difficult and complex one. This image is impressive with its large dramatic setting, filled with a staggering variety of characters and stories, assembled along the platform at Paddington. Within the figural group, there is a great range of emotion, including sadness, joy, fear, and surprise. The participants are beautifully delineated in a composition that exemplifies the Dickensian and English love for narrative, earlier explored by Hogarth. Here Frith exploited the Victorian fascination with intrigue, as well as the complexities of modern life. According to an article in the Illustrated London News, the exhibited painting of the railway station attracted some 83,000 visitors, which resulted in a large subscription list for the engraving on exhibit currently at Augustana, which made for a democratic art form affordable through mass production, as with Hogarth's prints. Paintings that similarly dealt with modern life but added the moralizing angle of Dickens might also be seen with stereotypically Victorian sentiment. In this period, we can find examples that depict scenarios to instruct both men and women toward greater moral fortitude. On the male side, let's examine The Last Day in the Old House of 1862 by Robert Martineau, which speaks to the perils of alcohol and gambling. How do we see the perils of alcohol? There's a hint. Look at the Lord of the Manor on the right. Drinking a toast to the old house with his young underaged son. How about Mom and the little girl in the middle? Not quite so festive? And then there's Grandma with the attorney on the left. Because why is it called The Last Day in the Old House? They have to give up the house. And there's a very big hint on the left, lower left corner, as to why. Horse racing. So basically, you have a very interesting Victorian scenario. Do you see where these are almost like melodramas, that you can read the visual imagery? And do remember that you have a burgeoning middle class at this time, and people that want art that's accessible, that's legible, that's easy to read. Now, in all fairness to the men here, I think we need to show the female version of how to lead a better life. On the other side of gender, let's consider Augustus Eggs, Past and Present, Scene 1 of 1858, regarding female sin and ultimate punishment. First of all, you can see that father's come home and he's not happy. Bad day at work? Probably not. He's holding something in his hand. A letter. And Mom is not too happy. His wife is not very happy about that letter, right? Was it one of their own love letters when they were courting? Probably not. He's discovered a lover's letter to his wife. So he is confronting her with it. If you look on the far right, there is a tempest landscape scene shown to reflect his mood, his anger. If you look on the painting on the left, it's the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. And after all, who got us in trouble first? Well, we'll leave a religion professor to further explore that. I always find it amazing in this painting to look at the two little girls playing. It's sort of like, oh dear, what's wrong with Mummy? As she's writhing on the floor. And I don't know how well you can see it in the middle of the front of the table, but can you see what she was doing before she was confronted with this letter? There's an apple that she was cutting. Apple, Adam and Eve, yeah. And do you see what the children are playing at on that chair? They're building a house of cards that's about to collapse. So basically, you can follow through this whole story, and believe it or not, there are 2 more scenes, but I'll let you Google those and find the outcome of this story yourselves. They become very moralistic, they become very narrative, and I do think Dickens was largely responsible for inspiring that in fine art painters, because such works echo the Dickensian mode. However, a new viewpoint in contrast to such moralizing, detailed realism was already in the air. Carr mentioned that Dickens came to be a celebrity in his own time, akin to Mark Twain in the United States. The next generation, epitomized by the respective celebrities of Oscar Wilde in literature and James McNeill Whistler, I promised I'd bring him in art, soon emerged. With them, such storytelling and moralizing was replaced by the aesthetic movement and a call for art's sake. In Whistler's early Thames-set etchings, such as Black Lion Wharf, although ostensibly dealing with lower-class workers among the dangerous and colorful Thames docks, which might seem equivalent to Frith's scurrying train passengers with detail of individuals and places, Whistler distinctively avoided such narrative. We do not get caught up in the story or individuality of this man. He is more like a prop, and of no greater importance than the ships and buildings in the scene, although presented in a detailed and balanced setting. As the movement gained momentum, Whistler's White Girl of 1862, although rejected by the Royal Academy, was independently exhibited in a gallery nearby. When a critic compared it to Dickens's protege, Wilkie Collins' novel, The Woman in White, the artist responded with his first of many letters to the press, stating, "May I beg to correct an erroneous impression, likely to be confirmed by a paragraph in your last number. The proprietors of the gallery have, without my sanction, called my picture The Woman in White. I had no intention whatsoever of illustrating Mr. Wilkie Collins' novel. So happens, indeed, I've never read it. My painting simply represents a girl dressed in white, standing in front of a white curtain." And when Whistler's painting was subsequently rejected by the French Salon and hung in the infamous Salon de Refusé of 1863, a French poet and critic noted the primacy of aesthetics here, stating aptly that it was simply a symphony in white. This parallel with music and its aesthetics, independent of narrative, centered Whistler's philosophy for the rest of his life. The Whistlerian model thus came to stand in sharp contrast to the Dickensian in matters artistic. Ultimately, Whistler's musical night scenes or nocturnes pushed the point, both in their nearly abstracted viewpoints as well as their broad titles. They challenged their Victorian audiences accustomed to the Dickensian mold. One of these, Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket of 1875, ignited a fierce response in art critic John Ruskin, who famously stated, "I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb or court jester ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public space." Whistler sued for libel, and it went to court with, as one newspaper reported, a butcher, baker, and candlestick maker as jurors deciding matters of high art. Whistler won the trial, despite Frith's appearing on Ruskin's side, since Ruskin had crossed the line of fair criticism by attacking the artist and not simply the art. Yet Whistler was only awarded a farthing in damages, which he was said to have bored a hole into and have boastfully sported on his watch chain for the rest of his life to celebrate his victory, despite his being bankrupted by the trial. At this time, Whistler felt he needed to clarify his philosophy to the public in an 1878 letter to the journal The World, later published in his autobiographical work, The Gentle Art of Making Enemies. You can see why this guy is fun to study. In it, he not only declared his viewpoint, but referenced Dickens's Trotty Veck, a porter and main character in his Christmas book, The Chimes. He stated, "Why should I not call my works symphonies, arrangements, harmonies, and nocturnes? I know that many good people think my nomenclature funny and myself eccentric. Yes, eccentric is the adjective they use for me. The vast majority of English folk cannot and will not consider a picture as a picture, apart from any story which it may be supposed to tell. My picture of a nocturne in gray and gold is an illustration of my meaning. A snow scene with a single black figure and a lighted tavern. I care nothing for the past, present, or future of that black figure, placed there because the black was wanted at the spot. All that I know is that my combination of gray and gold is the basis of the picture. Now this is precisely what my friends cannot grasp. They say, why not call it Trotty-Veck and sell it for a round harmony of gold guineas, naively acknowledging that without baptism there is no market. But even commercially, this stocking of your shop with the goods of another would be indecent. Custom alone has made it dignified. Not even the popularity of Dickens should be invoked to let an adventitious aid to art of another kind from his. I should hold it a vulgar and meretricious trick to excite people about Trotty-Veck when, if they could really care for pictorial art at all, they would know that the picture would have its own merit and not depend upon dramatic or legendary or local interest. As music is the poetry of sound, so is painting the poetry of sight, and the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony of sound or of color, end quote. Like his literary colleague, Oscar Wilde, Whistler clearly felt a need to record his opposition to Dickens and the old order in order to establish the new. Wilde, for example, had expressed ambivalent and often disparaging attitudes toward Dickens since his school days, admiring his humor and caricature, but loathing his moralizing. He once declared, "One must have a heart of stone to read the death of Little Nell without laughing." His provocative reversal of conventional responses marked a rejection of dominant attitudes, partly because they were popular, and partly because the aesthetic movement aimed at formalist aestheticism and reasserting elevated artistic genius. Whistler similarly used Dickens as a foil in reference to his nocturnes, as earlier quoted. Yet, both leaders of the new, in this tale, if you will, of two cities of London, competed with one another with such quips as Wilde stating to Whistler after he made a good joke at a dinner party, "Oh, Jimmy, I wish I'd said that," to which Whistler aptly responded, "You will, Oscar, you will." Yet beneath the surface of their personal and clever repartee, such competitive rebellion and reference indubitably betrayed the fact, although loath to admit it, that they both also were deeply imbued in, and indeed inspired by, the works of Charles Dickens. Thank you. I may have gone over time. Any questions? I am not a Dickens specialist. There are people here who probably are. I'm happy to talk at refreshments, but I have one extra little touch that I wanted to add. One thing about returning to your hometown is that your mother comes to your talks in the front row, I'll embarrass her, and has gone to all my Frieze lectures. And up to this one, she sat with a lovely lady named Ruth Evelyn Katz. And Karen began her lecture referencing Ruth Evelyn. I'd like to end mine that I have such great admiration, and she was such a cheerleader for everything regarding the community, culture, the arts. My mother, Barbara Carter, in the front, wanted to commemorate this by gifting a sum of money to Augustana to the art history department to do an appropriate memorial for Ruth Evelyn. And it seemed to me that a work of art, as we all know she loved art, might be best to do. So combined with the Anderson Endowment, we're going to officially unveil, or turn around, this Chagall in memory of Ruth Evelyn Katz, which goes on exhibit at Augustana's museum tomorrow. And you'll be able to see it there along with and it's particularly particularly fun, and you'll see that I brought Whistler in again, even though it's Chagall and it's 1963, because the title of the work is Nocturne Avance, Nocturne Avance. So Chagall was repeating sort of the tag teaming of titles from Whistler, and it seemed like an absolutely wondrous ethereal work with which to commemorate this lady that made all of this possible. Thank you.